Hi, I'm Natasha Chart, the board chair of Women's Liberation Front, and we're here for the latest in our Women Speak series of events, how the sex industry dehumanizes women and incites male violence. We have some women giving perspectives on the prostitution industry in Europe. Inga Klein is a radical feminist and activist in Munich, Germany. Her main focus is on sexual violence, on women's spaces, and on ending prostitution. She has led various campaigns in Germany and is part of several initiatives that strive to end prostitution in Germany, such as StopSexKauf.org and Abolition 2014. She is active at CAFRA, Communication Center for Women in Munich. Francine Sperenda is French-American, has a PhD, and is taught as a senior lecturer at a School of Political Sciences in the US. She's a radical feminist with a particular interest in male violence and prostitution. She just published a book in French, Surviving Prostitution, The Voices of the Unheard. She is the editor of the site Revolution Feministe. Yagmur Uygarkizi is a Turkish and French politics student. She's translated, written, and spoken in 3 languages on forms of male violence and discrimination against women that are not commonly perceived as such, including prostitution, pornography, and veiling. You can follow her work on borazansesli.com. All right, Francine.
Okay.
Talk to us.
Okay, prostitution is totally legal in Germany since a law which was called Prostitution Gesetz was passed under the Social Democrat government SPD of Gerhard Schröder with the support of the Green Party. This law, which was implemented in 2002, legalizes all aspects of prostitution, not just the selling of sex, but by women, but pimping and brothels as well. Pimping becomes a regular business and can be considered illegal only if it's exploitative. The reasons which were given initially for passing this law were mostly humanitarian. It was about improving the lot of prostituted women. In a modern country, they should have rights and social benefits like any other worker, retirement, medical coverage, etc. And society treating prostituted women like regular workers would remove the social stigma of prostitution, and there would be a moralization of the sex industry. The traditional control of organized crime over this industry would be eliminated. Criminals would be replaced by businessmen, etc., etc. From the start, it sounded like a fairy tale, and it was. I still wonder how people could be uninformed enough to believe that the regulation of prostitution by the state was the modern 21st century solution to the prostitution problem. The regulation of prostitution is almost as old as prostitution itself. It was in particular a system adopted in France and Great Britain and other Western countries during the 19th century, and it was abandoned because it didn't work. How the lobbyists who pushed this law managed to present this archaic system as a modern, human, and revolutionary is pure magic. In fact, the real concern behind this legalization was money, not the concern for prostituted persons' welfare and rights. It's about this basic fact. Prostitution is big business. It's big money. Its estimated turnover in Germany is around 15.5 billion euros per year. The state, the local authorities wanted their cut in this pie, of this pie. The Circus Act about we want to protect prostituted women, we want to give them rights and safety, was in fact about taxing them. Income tax, social security contributions, etc. But in order to tax women in prostitution and brothel owners, their business had to be made legal and registered. Regulation was the first step to taxing, and registration had to be compulsory. So laws were passed which made prostitution legal and registration compulsory for prostitutes as well as brothel managers. The registration process for prostituted women was essentially a meeting with a civil servant who would inform the woman about the law, her rights, and would determine if this person was engaging in prostitution freely or if she was coerced by traffickers. There would be also medical information provided. The restitution process was not a success. Prostituted women were not interested in paying taxes and social security contributions. They were not convinced by the prospect of retirement benefits. They were not seduced by the prospect of being publicly known as prostitutes for life. So far, out of an estimated number of 200,000 to 400,000 persons in prostitution in Germany, only about 38,000 have registered. That's about 1 or 2 out of 10. The rest is illegal prostitution. That the vast majority of prostituted women and brothels remain illegal is no surprise. It was the same during the 19th century in France and in the countries that regulated prostitution. Regulation by the state tends to boost clandestine prostitution, and of course, it shows that the lessons of the past were forgotten. In Hamburg, in 2018, out of 4,000 to 6,000 prostituted women, only 600 were registered. Michael Berretin, the boss of the Pasha chain of brothels, said it bluntly: prostitution has been legalized to bring lots of money to the government. And among the goals which were set to justify the passing of this law, only this one has been reached: more money for the government. For all the other goals, it's a dismal failure. The security of prostituted women has not been improved. These women are traditionally the target of male aggression and murder. This has not changed. In Germany, from 2002 to 2018, 91 women in prostitution have been killed, and there were 48 attempted murders. In the Netherlands, in 30 years, 127 prostituted women were killed, mostly by Johns. Being in prostitution is risking one's life every day, like the survivor of prostitution, Lauren Crossan, said in the interview I did with her. Following the passing of the law, there was a massive increase in the number of prostituted persons, plus 25% in the Netherlands in the year after the law passed, plus 30% in Germany. And as I said, illegal prostitution is way more important than the legal kind. The figure for Germany is that the number of illegal brothels is up to 3 times the number of legal ones. Of course, there was also a steep increase in the number of Johns. In Germany, the number of men visiting brothels or prostitutes is 1.2 million per day. In the Netherlands, the statistic is that 2 men out of 3 have purchased sex. In a country like Sweden, which has adopted the Nordic model of prostitution, that is, where the purchase of sex is illegal, the proportion is less than 1 in 10. And of course, as a result, there was an increase in human trafficking for prostitution purposes in these countries. Because very few people enter prostitution willingly, trafficking women for prostitution means essentially bringing illegal immigrant or migrant women in Germany, mostly from Eastern Europe, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and so forth. According to observations, about 90, even 95% in some areas of the women in German brothels are foreign. Most of them don't even speak German. This traffic of women for prostitution is illegal in several ways. Many women imported in Germany for prostitution are illegal, and also there are about 30 to 40% minors who are victims of this traffic. Germany and the Netherlands are listed among the 5 worst countries in the world for human trafficking, and it's directly linked to their legalization of prostitution. Female bodies, which are the merchandise, is what brothels sell, and they must get it no matter what. In Germany, besides international gang trafficking women from foreign countries, there are also biker gangs which are involved in this trafficking of women, like the Hells Angels kind and so forth. And this trafficking of women is of course organized by organized crime, like it has always been. And this is something that has been totally overlooked by the people who drafted this law, that organized crime has always been behind prostitution, whether petty criminal pimps or networks, and that legalizing prostitution would amount to legalizing an important section of organized crime. They assumed that legalizing prostitution would make it clean. It would turn it into a regular business. But the mafia types would somehow be replaced by graduates from business schools. That didn't happen. The same people remain in the cockpit and are running the show. One item in the modification of the law implemented in 2017 stipulated that in order to run a brothel, the manager should have no criminal record. That's a good decision, but it was also underestimating the capacity of organized crime to get around the law. The business owners and managers simply resorted to straw men. In Germany, the Ministry of Justice communicated this statistic: about half the managers and owners of brothel chains are convicts. And of course, legalizing all aspects of prostitution, like Germany did, include pimping. The law specifies that only exploitative pimping is punishable by law. What is non-exploitative pimping? Non-exploitative pimping is an oxymoron. Legalizing prostitution has been a gift to organized crime, whose profits have been hugely boosted by it. So given the small number of independent prostitutes, each time a punter goes to a brothel, part of the money he pays goes to organized crime. Because prostitution is in a sense a transaction between men, the pimp sells, the John buys, and the product is a woman. This big flow of money allows the managers and owners of brothels to corrupt the media. So they publish articles favorable to their industry to pay, and they can pay politicians, so they pass laws and regulations favorable to their industry. So all sorts of people are paid under the table if they can be of service to the sex industry. For a price, lots of people can be bought, and the sex industry can pay. And there is also this, I see this law as a bureaucratic monster. Because in order to organize the registration and taxation of prostituted persons and brothels, and what they can do and can't do, mountains of rules and regulations have been drafted, and administrative bodies have been created to implement these rules. What you notice when you study this set of rules is that quite a few of them are inapplicable, so complex and unrealistic that they cannot be enforced, and you wonder if it was not intended. Just a few examples. The registration process. Any person wanting to be registered as a prostitute must have an interview, as I said, with a civil servant who is supposed to inform her about the law and her rights and determine if she's forced into prostitution or not. First, as I mentioned, most of the women brought in Germany speak no English. So how can they be informed thoroughly about the law and their rights if they don't speak the language? Some bring their German pimp to the interview as a translator. And how can these civil servants determine that they are not trafficked? What are the criteria? It can only be guesswork. And of course, the flat rate formula and the gangbangs and any publicity for it are now prohibited after the law, which was passed in 2017. But the brothel managers have just changed the language. Gangbangs have been renamed orgies, and flat rates are called day pass, etc. And the thing that I found most strange is that condoms were made compulsory by the 2017 law. Of course, it sends a message to the Johns, but in reality, a woman in a brothel who refuses men who don't want to wear condoms will be seen as somebody who is really difficult. And if she dares to denounce Johns to the police, she will be shunned and quickly thrown out in most cases. And of course, the joints are usually willing to pay extra to go bareback anyway, which is a consideration. As far as I know, this law has been used to get rid of unwanted customers mostly. And unless they create brigades of penis inspectors whose job would be to knock on doors in Brussels to check if condoms are used, this law is mostly words on paper. And I mentioned the straw men running Brussels in place of convicts. In fact, convicts are not always seriously pursued by the police, except for tax reasons. Making pimping legal makes police work more complicated. What are you going to arrest these men for? Still, whenever there are police raids, the police finds almost always something illegal. Of course, illegal immigrants, minors, drugs, weapons, etc. Also, the 2017 law stipulates that brothel managers could not give direction to the women in their brothels, but the prostituted women there are not exactly on a similar footage as the managers. So I don't believe this law can be really implemented. The manager is still the boss. And basically, the fundamental problem that I see in these laws is that they are supposed to regulate activities which are intrinsically abusive and criminal. It's like the authors of these laws thought that no matter how abusive and criminal something is, if it's bureaucratically regulated, the criminal aspect will disappear. Everything will be okay. Bureaucracy can solve all problems. Administrative takeover cleans up everything, but it's just the opposite. The abuse is worse when it's validated and regulated by the state. And the last thing I want to say is that basically there was a change of scale which was brought by this law. Before the epidemic, at least as far as I know, the field was controlled by three major players. The Paradise Network, which is run or was run by Jürgen Rudloff, and the chain has brothel in like maybe half a dozen, possibly more cities in Germany, and some also in Austria. And there was a Pasha chain, which was run by Michael Beretin and Hermann Müller. And these people own a huge brothel. They're spreading on 11 floors, 140 rooms, and they can accommodate up to 1,000 joints per day. And I've read that Beretin at some time was thinking of listing his company on the stock market, and I don't know if he has done it. And I know that the Pasha, the big Pasha in Köln just went bankrupt due to the epidemic. And finally, the chain of the Prince Marcus von Anhalt, who owns something like 20 brothels and clubs, where more than 100,000 women are prostituted. And all of these men are convicts. They have been sentenced and fined for a variety of crimes and misdemeanors, in particular money laundering, tax fraud, and the traffics mentioned above. And what I want to underline is the big scale of the sex industry in Germany. In the past, the sex industry was small scale. It was, I would call it, with quotation marks, sort of a craft, and it was mostly at local level for Brussels and possibly at national level for the trafficking, for the recruiting of women. But one way in which the German law has changed the landscape of prostitution is that it induced a major change of scale in the industry. Basically, what it has done, it has favored the evolution of the industry toward monopoly and concentration. Michael Beretin said it himself, the new legislation will close down the small brothels, only the big ones will survive. The business model of the sex industry in Germany, at least until recently, tended toward multinational companies and Uberization. And basically, it's also a big money maker, as I've mentioned before. Renting a room in a brothel is very costly. It can run up to 180 euros a day. and a room basically renting a room can bring about 500,000 euro to the brothel manager. So all this makes prostitution a very attractive business for criminals. The merchandise is cheap, the level of taxation is low, the profits are big. And so based on that, on this consideration, the business was thriving in Germany, of course, until the COVID struck. And of course, this changed, it changed the landscape. But basically, this was really, the work industry is totally adequate, for the sex business in the US. It's really become an industry.
All right. Thank you, Francine. Would you like to follow up on that?
Yes. Well, basically, is there any questions that people want to ask?
Well, I think it was really fascinating and had a lot of very important details.
Yeah, I'm sure since you are basically much closer to the system than me, I'm sure you can bring a lot more detail than what I gave. Basically it was just a sort of an overlook, and
Yes,
that's
also,
I just wanted to talk about the thing that really struck me, in the prostitution system in Germany.
Yeah, and you're so right. And also the bureaucratic monster and this German idea that if you organize an administrative bureaucratic process around something, you can always ignore the human rights abuse at the center. There is really a long German history about that. So this is really how it works, and I thought it was really fascinating. I think I will obviously repeat some points, but I also wanted to show the outcome, the messages to women and to women in prostitution.
Yes, very important, because prostitution affects all women, just, the women in prostitution, definitely, yes.
And maybe a bit more about what is happening now with the COVID crisis, because we have some attempts at instituting the Swedish approach. 16 persons from Parliament, from our Bundestag, which is like the House of Representatives, have done a cross-party committee and tried to get the Nordic model. And the idea was that the crisis could actually be used, because right now the business is more or less down anyway. But some cities in Germany allowed street prostitution throughout the crisis, and some states are even now reopening brothels. Although it must be clear to anyone that any woman in prostitution now cannot be so out of her free will. No woman would now want to be in prostitution with such a pandemic, such an illness going around. And yet, prostitution is being made possible again, and it is cynically being sold as doing these women a favor, because otherwise what would they do? And in between, brothel owners even offered in Berlin to have abused women who are suffering from the lockdown and abuse of husbands to house these maybe in the brothels, which were now empty. Which of course is, it didn't happen, but some people in the Berlin Senate apparently had this idea, and it was being offered by brothel owners. So you can have one group of vulnerable women placed straight in the care of brothel owners. But that is Berlin, which implemented all of the demands. But I would like to, if I can, I would start on my presentation now. And I've also done a PowerPoint, so let's see how the screen sharing bit works here. Thailand, what you'll see. Good. I'm not perfect on PowerPoint, so wait a minute. This is how I'll do it. Okay. So again, it's a legalized regime and its outcome, and I want to show what it actually means when Germany and the Netherlands took the full approach, an approach of full legalization and partial decriminalization. Of course, especially, I suppose, for you as audience, what is important is to say that, of course, it makes sense to decriminalize those in prostitution, and it might make them marginally safer, because, okay, this is not punishing, not fining, not jailing the woman in the streets. Of course, this type of prostitution has been decriminalized in Germany for decades, for 100 years at least. So this wasn't new. What was new now was to legalize the entire structure around these women. And that is not a good idea. And as Francine pointed out, listed again here what the hope was. The hope was to make the women safe, to end the double moral standards in society, to enable her to find safe employment with employees' rights in brothels or with escort agencies, and so she would have health insurance and social security, and also, as we were told, to sue a buyer for non-payment. We have not had any single case of that happening. We have had a case recently where a man sued a woman in prostitution because he didn't like her services, and she had to pay. So this is how that worked out. And also, just like Francine pointed out, the real reason was to increase state revenue. So women would pay into the public health insurances, into social security, and contribute to taxes. The law was passed at a time when we had our first huge austerity package, and a lot of laws for women were made worse, especially for married women and mothers, as regarded their pension rights and social security rights. And in that time, when women and mothers were really had their pension rights slashed, there was also this law to make women in prostitution pay towards these systems. So the old 70s slogan by feminists that the state is in fact the worst pimp of all is still true. 5 years into full legalization and part decriminalization of the sex trade, a government evaluation that did not even address questions like violence found no viable indications that exploitative or criminal structures in the field of prostitution had lessened, and it was only brothel keepers who noted an improvement. And this mirrors findings, for example, in New Zealand, in the 2 evaluations New Zealand had on their own approach, where again it was operators, as this is termed in pro-sex industry language, who reported improved businesses and business conditions, while those in prostitution noted no improvement. Similar evaluations also in the Netherlands came to these conclusions, and now both the Netherlands and Germany have backpedaled on the liberalization of the sex trade, and now we have instated these heavily regulated regimes that Francine was talking about, where women in prostitution are supposed to register, the kind of regulatory regime which has been failing in Europe since the Middle Ages. I mean, the Middle Ages and early modern cities had state-run official brothels. And when you read reports from women in prostitution taken down by city officials in 1560, they sound like the ones taken down in 2020. So we are now doing the European medieval model. The registration, of course, has only started in 2017 after the 2016 law. And of course, disrupted by the pandemic, we still don't know how this is going to be working out. I'm listing some of the evaluations here with their full title because you can look those up. When you read these, it is important, especially in Germany and in the New Zealand and in the Netherlands, not just to read the summaries, but to look at the data itself. Both Germany and New Zealand will tell you that basically everything is okay and we're on a good route and things are going to improve, when in fact, of course, this isn't true. So it is important to see what the data actually says. When a New Zealand report admits, just like the German report does, that we never had any solid data to base our laws on. It is also important, of course, to make a distinction between a law and its implementation, because implementing, just making brothel keeping legal and letting the sex industry run with this is an easy form of implementation. Offering valid exit support is much harder when you talk about implementing a law. Of course, in practice, none of the German hopes regarding a legalized regime have materialized at all, except, of course, as regards taxes, which in practice means that tax debt now operate as exit barriers for women who want to exit. They are sent statements by tax offices demanding they pay something between 5,000 and 20,000 euros, which is a little more than that in dollars, 5,200 or $24,000 in taxes. And that is their debt as they exit prostitution. What it has led to is an exploded market. Oh, here, among the evaluations, I would also like to draw attention to this one. I think Yagmur can tell us more about it also, the Fondation Cell, because they do annual reports and many reports about the sex industry worldwide, and they have the most solid data. And I'd also like to recommend those if you want to have data and numbers and figures you can trust. Now, exploded market. This is just a street in Hamburg, and this is how much in your face the sex industry is. Where I live in Munich, in some areas, it's quite clandestine. If you walk the streets, you think you're just among office buildings, and it is only at night when office workers are gone that you can see the red curtain and the red signs. In places like Hamburg or Frankfurt, this is what you see. So we have an exploded market, and this is where I'd really caution anyone discussing this never to fall for what I call the number and data game. All of these warnings of prostitution going underground and that making it worse, or how STDs will spread faster if prostitution somehow isn't legal, of how pimping and coercion and trafficking will be harder to identify or prosecute. No, none of that is true. And especially in Germany, in New Zealand or the Netherlands, what we are dealing with now is a huge prostitution market. So whatever the percentages or carefully calculated minute differences in percentages, an exploded market in prostitution also means an explosion in all of its inherent aspects, or what the sex industry calls incidental aspects. A prostitution market of, for example, as Francine already cited, so I need to discuss numbers later, 1.2 million men buying sexual access to women each day with 400,000 women, is going to enable significantly more violence, pimping, trafficking, and coercion than a small market will that does not have government support and guarantees. And of course, the same is true of STDs. A huge prostitution market means an increase, a small one doesn't. No virus or bacteria is interested in a law book. That is not how these things work. They operate in bulk. And all of the serious and larger studies into prostitution regimes and trafficking show how legalization increases trafficking. And of course it does, as a huge market demands a huge supply. The idea that up to hundreds of thousands of women in Germany or Eastern Europe are just dreaming of a career in sex work in our German brothels should be too much even for the most gullible and sheltered liberal or misogynist to swallow. A second outcome is an obscuring of data. In order to illustrate this, this is now a photograph taken in Frankfurt in the red light area where entire houses are given over to prostitution. These are brothels or sometimes mini apartments, and the prices are up to 185 euros a night. Sometimes this includes a rebate towards VAT. Prostituted women in Germany are required to pay value-added tax, 19%. This is levied via the brothel owners. A tax official will come and collect the money from the brothel keeper, together with maybe a municipal extra tax also on each of the women in the brothels. Under the new law, the woman is now entitled to a receipt. So when she does her tax statement, and we were hoping she will have all of these folders ready, she can already state that she has already paid the VAT and won't be taxed double. I mean, all of this is really just crazy. What you can also see with the flowers and the posters is a photo of our annual action, our commemoration of women murdered in prostitution, which we set up in Frankfurt each year as Frankfurt celebrates this red light area. And last time we were smack next to the brothels doing it. So we show what the sex industry really means, and we do it right in their face each August. This August we didn't, but before. It is an obscuring of data, but it is Germany that cannot actually point to any valid data about prostitution at all, and not even after more than 50 years of a legalized regime. We have these numbers of 1.2 million buyers and of roughly 400,000 women in prostitution, and they are cited in our government papers when the 2002 Prostitution Act was passed. But there was never actually any real basis. They were taken from pro-prostitution lobbying groups, and they are still cited. So if the number was 1.2 million in buyers in 2002, before legalization, and 400,000 women before legalization, the idea is what would it be like now? In Germany, pointing to Sweden, saying Sweden has an underground problem, while we can't even say how many women are in prostitution by 6-digit numbers, is a bit rich. Legalization, of course, has provided pimping and trafficking with a legal facade, as now pimping is regarded similar as the work that agents do, and criminal investigations are limited to exploitative pimping or derivative pimping, and those are almost impossible to prove, just as this and trafficking counts as an operational aspect of the sex trade. The Greens, who were also quite instrumental in passing this law, were proud to report in 2011, I believe, that prosecutions for pimping had gone down by 99%, and they actually viewed this as a success of this law. But if you decriminalize criminalized behavior, you are, of course, going to see a 99% decrease in prosecutions. So this kind of regime does nothing to help women, and those who are still in the most appalling conditions are all of those who are counted as illegal, in inverted commas, illegal immigrants or refugees, those who do not have a right of residence here or do not have a right to work here. And their situation is awful, and it doesn't really matter what kind of regime a legalized regime says. On the contrary, their condition becomes worse because they cannot now even be counted as trafficking victims. If a state decides that prostitution is violence against women and that a buyer enacts harm on her on buying her, trafficking her into prostitution means getting her into an abusive situation. This means international law that prohibits the re-victimization of victims can now work. She may now be given a right of stay. Since prostitution is not counted as abusive, she's not counted as a victim of any crime. And that means she has no legal due cause. It is Germany which not only has an underground, or let me go to the Netherlands. They had a report which also found that criminal gangs, of course, continued operating. Pimping was at high levels, and their victims were found in the Netherlands' legal brothels. Germany here does not only send women into an underground, legalized regimes provide the underground for the sex trade. They actually make it by establishing this facade. And pointing to Sweden only serves to distract from the violence in Germany, which we have actually in plain sight. We do not even have to go underground to find it. Another outcome is a spreading of the business, a kind of diversification of it. Health insurance. When prostitution became legal and it was made easier for women in prostitution to access these, some health insurances and some cities and municipalities speculated how STDs and HIV could be counted as occupational hazard. And this allowed health insurances to increase their fees by 500 euros a month for these women. In the Netherlands, police found a clinic that offered discounts on breast enlargement surgery if the women were brought by their pimps. They had special arrangements with certain traffickers on that kind of surgery. An especially offensive article titled "More Bang for Your Buck," which was published in The Economist, showed how women do a market assessment according to this article and organize their modifications. The article showed prices in correlation to hair color and breast size and calculated how long a prostituted woman would need to recover her operating costs, and sold this as a form of empowerment. What we also see in Germany is tax advisors, lawyers, insurance brokers who attend symposiums and seminars and events organized by the pro-tax industry lobbyists, because they want to sell things. They want to sell their insurances. They want to act as tax advisors to prostitution. Now, with the new law, which means registration, women are required to have an address at which their mail can be sent, and lawyers have gladly and kindly stepped up to provide them with such an address and to forward their mails, again making money off their backs. So the people who try to cash in on prostitution also explode in such a market. Then we have the sexual assistance. The idea marketed as favor to disabled persons, of course they mean men, and a disabled person's or disabled men's alleged right to sex. And they include those with severe dementia or severe cognitive restrictions in this kind of approach. This is actually offered to women in prostitution who can no longer compete with the very young women in brothels or in escort agencies, and it is offered instead of valid exit support. It not only turns abused persons into abusers, it also again enables business schemes to exploit these women, because now you have individuals or companies who offer courses and who offer certificates in sexual exploitation, which the women pay for. These are useless because care homes do not, in fact, admit this on their premises. Still, these courses are offered. They are marketed on the sites of advocacy centers and groups that are supposed to help women in prostitution. Some were at a time even sponsored by organizations like Pro Familia, which are a bit like Planned Parenthood in the States, who also published illegal expertise on why or how doing this to a severely handicapped person is not considered to be sexual abuse and assault. They concluded in this expertise that it isn't, and that might certainly be true, because, of course, it should come as no surprise that a society that believes in the myth of happy and voluntary prostitution cannot have strong laws or a strong legal practice against assault or sexual abuse or rape, and we don't. In Austria, there was one group which offered such courses, and women completing these courses had to stay with these companies for 1.5 years and to go where the company sends them, which, of course, in normal languages, in a correct term, that would be pimping and coercion. There are worse markets. There are special pockets, for example, for pregnant women, where buyers seek out heavily pregnant women because they want to feel the baby move inside her. We also have a specific market for trans persons in prostitution, marketed as she-males or ladyboys. The Pasche, the brothel which has now gone bust, had one entire floor for this type of prostitution, and of course for young men or even boys. We have an advocacy center in Berlin, allegedly there to support these, who at some point had a list of things for young men or boys to do to be safe in prostitution, and it listed punctuality, cleanliness, and tidiness is what is appreciated by buyers. We scandalized it, so this is now gone, but it can still be found on other websites. This is their idea of supporting people in prostitution. As a warning now, and this is simply for viewers over 18, I'll show you one of these ads for a woman who was pregnant. It's this one here. It says she's 19, maybe she's all of 21, but she's still a very young woman, and she's pregnant. You have very offensive language listed next to her about what she will do, how she will swallow everything and all of this. It was part of a film production series. So here you have a very, very strong, I just move on and take it off again, a very strong connection to porn production and prostitution. It was a pornographic filming set. The buyers had a set fee of €35, which is probably $36, drinks and snacks included, no condoms, but please, they could wear masks if they wanted to. This was filmed. All of this is accessible to anyone. A 9-year-old child who knows how to work a computer can find it. An 11-year-old boy can find it. We could find it. They had a report about it, photographs of the gangbang, of the rape, photographs of her genitals, description of her genitals after this abuse, and all of it in a very jubilant language of how much fun everybody had and how great it was. So this is also an outcome. And I did not use, I'm not a computer hacker, and I did not use any complicated scheme to access this. We have the links, and you click on it. You can find it by just entering Tina gangbang in a Google search, and you'll find it. Okay, messages to women and girls. These are two photographs. One is in Hamburg, Herbertstraße. This street is cordoned, it's a small street, it's cordoned off at both sides by a metal door. This goes back to the Nazi era, which went back to an older idea of dedicating entire streets in slums, more or less, to prostitution. So this is where women were supposed to be living and working, and they should be independent of pimps and organize their own business. Of course, none of that works. It's a public street in Hamburg. And as you can see on the photo, entrance is men only. This is on the photograph as its back end, which is a bit dirtier. The front end has the same photo and the same door and the same posters, but it's a bit cleaner. And it tells you that you cannot get in under 18 and women are prohibited, which also tells us that women in prostitution somehow aren't women, which is also something to think of when you get all of this empowerment talk. On the right hand is a photo which Julie Bindel took when she looked at prostitution in Munich. It is the entrance to one of our brothels. 2 years later or 3 years later, the mannequin and the cage still exists. Last time I saw this, they had put a bikini on her and a blonde wig. I don't think I need to say more, but that is on the image to women. Let's move to the image to children and girls, and especially the messages to immigrant children and girls. Frankfurt, the red light area where we do our action, and I walked around the day afterwards, after this celebration, and it was one of the worst things I'd seen in my life. This was taken before we set up our things. It's an area which has, these streets have these kind of dancing clubs and meeting clubs and drink clubs. The brothels are in the next street. It also has ordinary flats and apartments where children live, and it's of course a poor area. It's hit now by gentrification, and maybe gentrification will make the brothels go away, but it was just a snapshot. I mean, you can't walk around and just take photos in people's faces. You're very safe because pimps do not want trouble on their doorstep, but I didn't want to photograph people because of their dignity. I only saw it when I looked at these photos at home. A little girl in pink, and behind her, the women in magenta. So this is what you grow up to. Again, here you have immigrant children. Immigrant because of the streets where they live, and when you come closer, you can see it in the colors. Next to these meeting places, and have a look at these ATMs here, which are right inside the bodies and photographs of pornified women. So that's a message. The message to women in prostitution is Berlin these days. The street prostitution in Kurfürstenstraße has become so awful that it could no longer be ignored. Berlin has no zoning areas, no zoning regulations at all. It has street prostitution areas, which are called Hartgeldstrich, hard money prostitution, because prices are so low that they can be paid in coins. Now, in order not to have the street prostitution as rampant, as visible, Berlin has started to use things like toilets, these Portaloo or Dixie toilets, and make them places for prostitution. And because we are Berlin and Germany and sustainable, ours are ecological. So they don't have a water supply. They're not even chemical. You mustn't throw condoms into these toilets. This is what they look like. And they're being used now as Verrichtungsboxen or sex loos, which is what the people in Berlin call them. Berlin wants 5 of those. 3 have been put up. One of them costs 5,500 euros for the city to maintain. If that money were put into helping exit, 2 to 3 women could exit comfortably. So here it is from outside. Here, this is from Café Neustadt, an advocacy center in Berlin that is serious and also now collects money for women who are fined if they are found in prostitution in spite of COVID, or during the pandemic, they just moved their tables outside to provide help to women and cash and food. This is what the things look like inside. So this is the message to women. And let me just recall you that the Prostitution Act was to end double model standards and to help destigmatize women in prostitution. Okay. The informed approach, of course, is to decriminalize those in prostitution and not to decriminalize the entire structure around prostitution. Of course, instituting a criminalization of the buyer and walking off is not going to happen. So I want to end on what the Nordic model means when you have it completely here. And it's this one here, of course. An informed, equality-based approach means you decriminalize those in prostitution, you institute valid, informed, and sustainable exit support, which also needs to include, like I think the French law now does, a scrapping of fees incurred in prostitution, possibility of getting rid of some of the debts, and of course of the tax debt. You also need to support women who go back into prostitution as an exit attempt fails, because exiting prostitution is difficult and there are many, many parallels to women going back to abusive husbands. But just because she goes back doesn't mean the violence doesn't happen. And just because she goes back doesn't mean you can call it voluntary action and withdraw help. So you really need valid, informed, and sustainable support. You also need a training of police and of social workers to understand this approach, and public awareness campaigns and sexual education in schools that includes equality and consent. And of course, you need to criminalize buyers and traffickers, and you need survivor input. My last image is just of some suggested reading here. There is a lot of good stuff around, but I just wanted to show this for people who want to get informed. So you have Kathleen Berry's books, of course. You've got Rachel Morin, which is a really, really good account of a single woman and her experiences, and she always analyzes this in the context of prostitution. Janice Raymond, who showed how the lobbying tactics worked and how this could be brought to the Netherlands and Germany. Kaiser Ikes Eggman's book on both on prostitution and surrogacy, which is really a classic. And of course, if you want to look up numbers, data, current studies, the Prostitution Research and Education website by Melissa Farley. And on the right-hand side, this is just where you find stuff in English about Germany. That's our websites here when we started, and when we were really very lone voices opposing this industry in Germany. And my presentation also ends with that. So I'll stop sharing this as soon as I find out how I stop it up. Here I am. Okay.
Thank you so much, Inga. That's
awful.
Horrifying. Would we be able to perhaps get your presentation to share on our website?
Yes, I can send it to you, and also the sources and links.
Okay, thanks so much. I think that'll be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yagmur, would you?
Yes,
I
will kind of wrap up a lot of the points you've talked about and conclude a little bit. So I will share my screen with you. And we've talked a lot about the harm in prostitution. And I would like to, as a premise, before any presentation about best practices, policy practices, I would like to start with a very simple question, which is, when do we say that women in prostitution have been raped? And, excuse me, we say that when men have not paid. That is the only time that we distinguish between the daily acts that men subject women in prostitution to from rape. So what does that essentially mean? That means, just like in this notice board from it's an old notice board in an Italian brothel that reminds the dear customers that it is forbidden to molest the ladies before payment. So after payment, it no longer counts as molestation. So this is the message of prostitution. Unfortunately, we tend to understand rape. We always look at the relationship between the male aggressor and the female victim. And to be more specific, we look at ownership. So it took us a long time to make laws against marital rape. Why? Because we still live, our mindset, our patriarchal mindset says that the husband owns the wife, so how could he possibly rape her? And we have the same problem with prostitution, where we say the man has paid the woman, how could he possibly rape her? And this is why prostitution is a form of regulation of rape. Imagine you lived in a state where murder is allowed Monday to Friday. It's forbidden Monday to Friday, excuse me, but on Saturday. Imagine a man murders his wife on a Saturday. He can only be prosecuted for not having respected the opening hours. Since murder per se is no longer a problem, it becomes, as Francine said, a bureaucratic issue. So it's no longer a crime. This is the only way. We can't have on one side a state that says that rape is forbidden, and on the other that says that it is allowed if you do it under certain conditions, if you paid the woman before, if you do it in designated areas, a brothel, and etc. So the only way is to abolish prostitution. And why do I talk about abolishing prostitution? I feel that the legal-illegal framework cannot fully account for the fact that there are 3 parties involved in prostitution. I know we've seen that a lot in the previous presentations. And they all play a different role. So what is the French solution? Well, how do we abolish prostitution? So France in 2016 followed the footsteps of Sweden by adopting the so-called Nordic or equality model. And it follows one political principle, which is men are responsible for their actions and must be held accountable for them. So and prostitution is a form of male violence against women, so they should be criminalized for doing that. And it also follows an economic principle, which is that no demand equals no supply. So on the demand side, how is the French law operating? So in France, we call them prostituters. So perhaps it's etymologically not so accurate, but it's really to give the idea of the active male side and to rebalance. So you're not just a prostituted woman, there's a man that is doing that to you, you know, so to have the 2 sides of this balance. And so the law is quite complete in that men are held accountable even if they contact women online. It is applicable abroad. So men that go in Germany, actually French men that go in Germany are actually bound to the French law that criminalizes their actions. And there are aggravating circumstances linked to vulnerability of the women who are exploited. And that mainly means age or health conditions. So the law was passed in 2016, and in June this year, we had a report that had results for the first 3 years, because it ended in December 2019, the findings, that's when they ended. And so an overall assessment of this law, which is still recent, is that whenever it is implemented, results are getting in. So we've already had almost 5,000 men that were arrested since 2017, even not even actually 2016. So, you know, we can imagine that's even more than that. But how do you call that? The punishment is too lax. And this is men themselves that say it, because unfortunately, it's not deterrent enough, because they have to, if it's their first time, and guess what? It's always their first time caught with a woman in prostitution. Well, they only have to pay a fine. So we can see this is very problematic, because men are getting away with rape by paying women, and then they're getting away with that rape by paying a fine. And a fine in French law is it's a minor offense. So it's under an offense. Stealing is considered a more serious crime than abusing a woman in prostitution. And it's under a crime, in which rape is. So we see, and the other option is that if they don't have a fine, they attend awareness raising courses. And from the accounts that we have in those awareness raising courses is that they want it to be more deterrent. They admit that that is not scaring them enough. And Sweden, this is why Sweden is increasingly going towards including men who rape women in prostitution and pursuing them for rape. This is where we should be heading towards. Now, the supply, I've put pimps, because as Francine was saying, the object of the supply is women, but the ones who are supplying are the pimps. And Kajsa Ekman makes this brilliant point when she says there is no such thing as the self and then the vagina, and vagina comes from sheath. So again, it's a terrible word. But so there's no split self. You can't sell yourself, right? So there's someone else that is selling you, and we always forget about the pimp. So the second men in this system of prostitution. So here the punishment is heavier. And what is very good about the Nordic model is that it is a self-sustaining model. Inge, you've been talking about the fact that Berlin is spending all this 5,000 euros, I believe, for those special toilets. It's a waste of money. Whereas the Nordic model, is a self-sustaining system financially, because you can seize the goods from the pimps, including buildings. And you can see that the amount seized has increased over the years as well, steadily. The number of pimping rings that have been dismantled is increasing. Unfortunately, almost half of the cases are dropped at the moment, so it's still not serious enough. And then there's the issue of pornography, because why is it that as soon as a pimp puts on a camera, he becomes an artist, and we call the prostitution pornography? I mean, pornography is a form of staged prostitution. You do it for the camera. And luckily, there seems to be a positive change in that as well in France, because feminists are now are helping in an investigation against a major pornography website that has permanently shifted the French culture about pornography, and they're under investigation for charges of pimping. So this is a positive advancement as well. Now the product, so the woman turned into objects. What the law entails to a company who are in the women, we must stress, are not criminalized. Only the pimps and the buyers are in this system. And the law is quite complete because they receive healthcare, they receive help with professional training, and temporary residency permits, specifically for women victims of trafficking as well. It's not enough, but it takes into account a lot of the aspects. And then you can see that almost 2 million euros were redistributed, so women could claim damages from the pimps, and the meaning of that is very important. You know, this law has a normative aspect that is incredible. And there are currently 395 women who are in exit programs, so who are trying to leave prostitution permanently. Now, there is another aspect that is quite interesting with the French law, is that it also acknowledges the role that we, the public, we have as bystanders, and how we participate to this crime. The more we glorify it, and the more we stand quiet about it. And so there are supposed to be education in schools, and there are supposed to be national campaigns. The official report says that not much has been seen about that. Why is there so much, why are we so shy with this law? There is quite a strong opposition, and we know why there would be opposition to this massive market. So we've seen who benefits from the sale of women, right? It's better than drugs, you know, you can sell them over and over and over and over. So we know this financial benefit of prostitution no matter what. But then there is also a very interesting legal benefit to so-called decriminalization of prostitution, and I will come to that. And there is another financial aspect to bear into account. So the main opposition in France has been led by this organization called STRAS, that stands for Union of Sex Workers. And they have actually challenged the law at the Constitutional Court in France. Obviously, they have failed, and now they are challenging it at the European level. So we must be careful about that. So this STRAS, when the official report was published with the findings of the law 3 years on, published a counter report. Obviously, they were not happy with the report, because all the report said it was, we must strengthen the law, but we're not coming back on it. We're not changing our minds. This law is staying. And there is one paragraph that I thought was fascinating, and it's terribly written as well. It says, it's important to stress the importance of a harm reduction policy, even when it comes to minors who are selling sexual services. So this means that according to the STRAS, girls in prostitution are not being exploited, they are selling sexual services. And this is where we see, so the people who make the distinction when they say, oh, an 18-year-old woman, or adolescent, I should say, teenager, an 18-year-old teenager in prostitution is fine, but if she's 17, it's not. You can see that this distinction is arbitrary. What the French law says is no matter your age, you are a victim, and the fact that you are younger is an aggravating circumstance. right? And this is more coherent, because if you say that prostitution is not inherently harmful, how can you justify why on earth shouldn't a 17-year-old do that as a part-time job, you know? So this position that girls in prostitution are not exploited is also the same that is of the wider group that the Strass is part of, which is the global network of sex work projects, the NSWP. It is the same position. So they have a policy brief on young sex workers where they say, oh, according to international law, any child, but we should say girl, under 18 that is in prostitution is exploited, but we will not use that term because that goes against the self-determination of those girls. So we've seen, so what is the interest of either regulating prostitution or decriminalizing it? So it's a form of regulation of rape. It means men can have access to girls. And then the other interest is trafficking, because they are introducing the notion, the NSWP is introducing the notion, both of you, Francine and Inge, have talked about it, of about the fact that trafficking is no longer a crime. They're talking about migrant sex worker. But according to the Palermo Protocol against trafficking, there cannot be such a thing. Because as long as a person is moved from one border to another for the purposes of sexual exploitation, well, that is trafficking. But if prostitution is a job, you're just having foreign workers in your company. So how could there ever be trafficking? So again, the people who say, I am for prostitution, I am against trafficking, they need to explain to me how that is possible, because as Julie Bindel puts it, trafficking is only a means to prostitution. It's one way of doing prostitution. Prostitution is the actual problem. And then of course, pimps are no longer pimps. NSWP calls them third parties. So they become third-party provider. So when we talk about the decriminalization of prostitution, so this is the case in New Zealand, where women in prostitution, men who abuse women in prostitution, and the pimps are decriminalized. What we should be talking about is privatization. So Kajsa, a parenthesis on that. Kajsa Ekman, again, makes this really good point about the fact that when you're in a crisis, people are not going to go around and buy chewing gums. They're not going to waste their precious money on basic consuming goods, right? So what happened in the first privatization wave that we had with neoliberal policies? Well, to make sure that people still keep on earning tremendous amounts of profits, you need to make sure you have a product that will sell in a time of crisis. So you privatize water, you privatize post, electricity, because you will always need those. What is happening now? And we have the same thing with drugs. We're calling it decriminalization of drugs, but it's essentially privatization. We say private companies will sell them from now on. And we have the same with prostitution. It's not, if we want it to be accurate, it's not decriminalization that is intended, it's privatization of pimping. So we end up like in New Zealand with the Cho brothers, who are now business owners. So it's no longer the state that is the pimp, as is the case in Germany or the Netherlands, and they're doing a terrible job at it anyway, as we have seen, because criminals have taken over anyway. But private parties. And finally, there is another thing that is really important in the agenda of NSWP, and I will end on this point. I have called the PrEP. So something that always comes up in the recommendations of NSWP is that women in prostitution should be using the PrEP. What is the PrEP? PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. So essentially, it's a preventive treatment against HIV. So isn't it odd that in all those years we haven't found a vaccine for AIDS, but instead we have a treatment that prevents from having AIDS. So what is this treatment? There are essentially two main drugs that are recognized and publicized for this treatment. One of them is Descovy, the other is Truvada. And those are daily pills. You have to take them every single day for an unlimited amount of time, because if you stop taking them, you're again exposed to HIV. Isn't that financially fantastic? And Inge, you've talked about something, I've noted it down. Of course, the virus doesn't follow law books. The larger the market, the larger the virus, isn't it? And of course, men do not want to wear condoms because the sense of the violation is not strong enough against women. So wouldn't it be fantastic if those women took those pills every day? Who pays for that? Took those pills every day so that those poor men do not have to wear condoms. And on whom the clinical trials are conducted? I will let you have a wild guess. And who produces those two drugs? Who knew Margaret Atwood was so prescient? It's Gilead. And you might have heard about this company in terms of research for COVID, that they are leading the research on that at the moment. So I will conclude. So to wrap up everything, prostitution is a regulation of rape. It is incompatible to have laws against rape and prostitution on the one side. So the only way is to abolish prostitution. And any other model is only bound to decriminalize trafficking, pimping, allowing more girls in prostitution, and then beyond the actual market that is created from the sale of women and girls, there is a pharmaceutical one that is closely related to it. And thank you. I will stop sharing.
Well, also horrifying. It's interesting because I saw when I was looking at this issue and how the policies were moved and being sort of pushed behind the scenes here in the US, that the so-called feminists who were pressuring their peers to agree that prostitution is wonderful and feminist and that we must support fully legalizing it, which we have not done yet. So we're just kind of like looking forward in horror and hoping that what you're describing doesn't become the future here, every place outside of Nevada and a few other places. That one of the big arguments was that it was supposed to be a harm reduction for HIV, that it was an HIV preventive measure to promote legalized prostitution. That was the argument, that there was this Lancet study and there were these ironclad rules, like if you, or not rules, but that they said that the numbers were just so good, it was incontrovertible, and if you cared about science, you just had to support this policy. You had to stand behind like Amnesty International saying that, well, now this is just the only acceptable human rights stand on this, and everybody had to go along with it. And they were pushing the idea that, oh yes, it's agency for these minors who are selling sex. I saw very similar language to that too, whereas in any other aspect of policy, you would consider that dehumanizing to children. You don't say that children have agency. That strips them of the adult protection that we all recognize that they need. And when you think about it at all, none of it makes, it doesn't make logical sense. These explanations are not good ones. They're not sound. How did this become so popular with all these policymakers? How were they convinced, pressured, whatever, to just abandon all decency and go hard in on pressing for the legalization of rape?
I think that is the question. I mean, what helped me understand the points the pro-sex industry lobby was making is also from Kaiser Ekis Eggman's book, when she said that they do not have arguments or points, they have a marketing strategy, and it is very, very adaptable. The marketing strategy employed by these lobbying groups differ from group to group to group to group. They have a set of marketing tools for the LGBTQ communities, a set of marketing tools for liberal feminism, a set of marketing tools even for conservatives. And I think this has made them so adaptable. But in the end, the question is misogyny the wave they are riding in on? There's absolute hatred of women, which we have in all cases. Or is it big business, or is it both? And I don't know which one of these helped carry it through. I mean, it's easy to look at the different tactics, how valid concerns from the 80s, like the double standards, the moral double standards against women in prostitution, were taken up and used in this marketing, or a very repressive idea that women shouldn't show their bodies and women are sluts if they do, and how to dismantle that is also something you can find. So they ripped stuff out of ordinary feminist and valid feminist work and used it in marketing again. But I think it is neoliberalization and neoliberalism. In Germany, the idea of the medication is actually being pushed by the Liberal Party. They had a question in the parliament about what women in prostitution's life is like, and 20 normal questions. And the last question is if these women are actually taking these pills. Trust our Liberal Party, which is a small party and which is 100% pro-business, to put the important stuff in the last question. And so you can see the rest is just a facade to push the sale of this medication. But I think neoliberalization and big business and the hatred of women.
And I think this talk about HIV is really, so it's the understanding that the only harm in prostitution is HIV, when we know the harm is the violation of your sexual integrity. And this is it's adopting male prostituting approach because we care about the health of the men who abuse women in prostitution. So God forbid they caught HIV, because God forbid they transmitted to their wives, because then problems would arise. And I think it's also linked to the collusion, direct collusion with entities like UNAIDS and the NSWP. I mean, there are any policy, they write policy briefs together, they have money together, they fund, like the funding, all of this, that explains.
Yeah.
Well, I think the ultimate explanation is neoliberalism. You know, it's the money rules, you know, I mean, anything for money. I mean, of course, the limits of decency are absolutely exploded because, you know, the reason, the ultimate goal is to make more money. You know, so it's just, you know, you can get into detail, but that's, you know, that's the main point, I think, you know.
Yes, and it ended any kind of, in France, I believe you're a bit safer from it, but in Germany or Britain, it has effectively ended any understanding of a class analysis of anything. Like Margaret Thatcher saying, there's no society, there's only individuals. And so you look at an individual and you don't understand that being a woman is a class, or being racialized is a class, and that this is a collective kind of practice and needs a collective response. And neoliberalism, I think, absolutely ended this kind of analysis and understanding. It's all individual now. And if people don't have agency, it is limited agency. And it would be wrong not to allow them to use it. I mean, that is what you find in trafficking discourses and in attempts at legalizing even trafficking, turning it also into a legalized business, where you're no longer talking about trafficking, but about a rational decision using limited agency to take out a special form of loan in the context of irregular work migration. And in fact, it's trafficking, it's just worded like this. So these marketing strategies always work on an individual. And you turn around classically victim and perpetrator, or the victim is no longer a victim because calling a victim is offensive as you deny their limited agency. And all of this has worked.
Can I ask you a question about how the COVID is going to affect prostitution in Germany? Is it going to work against it or for it?
We don't yet know. At first, we were quite hopeful because even before COVID, we had a large group of women in the Social Democrat Party now saying this attempt has failed, they want the Nordic model. And this cross-parliamentary group And the women's caucus, I think you would call it in the States, the women's group of the Christian Democrats has come out in favor of the Nordic model now as well. And since business was down during the lockdown, somehow apparently German men survived without prostitution. And so the idea was that we might be using it. But the pushback is enormous. As I said before, I mean, North Rhine-Westphalia, which is just on the border to France, has now decided to reopen brothels. Of course, there's a hygiene plan. I'm sure there's disinfectant for your hands at the beginning, and I'm sure they're going to be wearing masks, but they're reopening brothels now. Frankfurt always allowed street prostitution. Only very few cities instituted a fine for prostitution for the buyers. Everywhere else it was the women who were now criminalized for being in prostitution, or the man pays a minor fine for being in violation of hygiene and safety COVID regulations, and the woman pays a fine for illegal prostitution, which is much higher. But I can't really say what the outcome is going to be. All we could see is in our work that the number of persons who see prostitution as violence has increased, and the number of people who say it. Before, when we used to argue this, for example, on Facebook, it was always the same 5 women explaining the abolitionist model. Suddenly, the amount had increased into 20. Wow. And now suddenly it's full of people advocating for the Nordic model I've never heard of. I mean, before we were just a crowd of people like a big family party. You knew who was who. So we have managed to turn public awareness around. And I think the fact that this heavily regulated model simply doesn't work. The registration idea, for example, creates more problems than it solves. Might help, but I can't really say what the COVID crisis is going to do in the long term. Because
when the Pasha went bankrupt, maybe some other brothels are gonna...
That was a celebration, yes. The biggest brothel in Germany going bust. Yeah.
That's good news.
Yes.
Wow.
But it is not only women in prostitution who need an exit from prostitution. It is Germany as a society which needs an exit from prostitution as well. Absolutely, and it's going to be complicated. I'm glad about also to hear about France, because of course we keep hearing about the French model has failed and the Irish model has failed and so on. And again, we have to go back to the internet, find all the sources and so on to explode these lies.
Well, I always thought when they passed the law in France that they would try to sabotage the law to then say, well, it's not working, so let's give it up and switch back, to, legalization or something like that. And to me, I don't give up completely on the French law, but I think, its implementation has been really, really so low, so weak, I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not really convincing. I mean, 5,000 men arrested, over like 4 years or something like that. It's nothing. It's nothing, compared to the scope of the industry in France. I think there is like 20,000 to 30,000 prostitutes, in exercise in France. 5,000 men fined. It's just a drop, in a drop of water in the ocean, really.
Yeah. Actually,
yes, it's a first step, but...
Yeah, there was this, in another study that was published, I believe 2018, there was in 4 major cities, they followed the implementation of the law in 4 major cities, and in Bordeaux, so it's the southwest of France, citizens had to remind the authorities about the law, because there was so much unwillingness to implement it. And so you can see that it really comes down, and I think it's also linked to the structure of the French bureaucracy. So if there's one person that says no, the whole thing, it's kind of, so this is also an internal problem that we have, because in the territorial organization, it really depends on who is there, when.
Yes.
So whenever you have a change we have this figure called préfet. So they have a certain territorial jurisdiction, and it's also linked to immigration laws. So the more they are, how do you say that? They have negative views on immigration, the less likely they will be to want to implement the Nordic model as well, because of residency permits. So you can see how that is also linked.
Yes, I've seen there are big discrepancies between areas, indeed. But the problem is also, the police in France, I think, is mostly male still. It's like maybe only 20% police people are female. So basically, the law is implemented by men and who are not really keen on just creating problems to other men. Really, I see. I see it like that.
And also the men that were caught, they say that when they're caught by a woman, it's even more traumatic to them. And if they have to face a female judge, that's really a terrible effect already.
I mean, that is good. It should be an incentive to women to join the police force. I mean, yes. But when the French law was passed, I mean, I remember following the process and how long it took to be passed by the Senate in France and all of it. But it is so well made, it is so well worded, it is so well explained. And in presentations in Germany, I sometimes contrasted the introduction to the French law, which says that in accordance to international views and in accordance with human dignity and in accordance with principles by the French state that a human body can never be merchandised, you are passing this law. And in Germany, the Prostitutes Protection Law from 2016 begins with, prostitution is a business branch in which generates high turnover. That's about the first sentence. And the first sentence in France is that prostitution is a violation of international law and dignity. And our law, the justification, the kind of text you get when a law is passed, has about 60 pages explaining why we want this law. And on page 59, the last section is equality among men and women. And the last section is, they have found that there are certain gender-specific asymmetries in prostitution. And they hope that the new Prostitutes Protection Law will at least partially address these gender-specific asymmetries. And I mean, we do have a law in our constitution, that's law number 3, that men and women are equal, and the state is actually under obligation. That's law Article 3, sentence 2 in our constitution, that the state has to strive to eliminate inequalities. It doesn't say it has to work towards partially addressing gender-specific asymmetries, but that is in the language of our law. And compared to that, the French law is so strong and so beautiful. And it is well made, I mean, down to the municipal level, down to how exit programs are going to be implemented, what kind of infrastructure has to be created. So you can see how much thought went into it and how much knowledge. So I would like us to take this as well. And of course, it has to be implemented.
Yagmur, what do you think about these workshops for punters in France? I've done an interview about that, and the lady that does these workshops, she's a survivor of prostitution. Her name is Laurence Noël, and she said that yes, it works. I mean, there are some guys that say, "Oh well, I didn't know. You were teaching me things that I absolutely didn't know about, and I'm going to change, and this and that." And what do you think about that?
I will speak in my own name about this, so not without any organization that I've worked with or anything, because I know that doesn't represent the opinion. So I know in the US, for example, you have this movement at the moment, which is abolition of prisons, which is odd because we can't even get men into prisons. Rapists never get charged anywhere in the world, right? So we're not there yet about abolition. And I think that if this prison, I think, men have come up with it, so they must know something about it, why they did, right? But whenever we need to punish men for crimes they have done to women, we don't go into the punishment men have come up with themselves. We come into alternative punishments. So those poor men who beat their wives, let's give them a class and they will understand why it's so bad. What do you think? Of course they know it's bad. I mean, the men who go into women in prostitution know that the women don't want to be with them. Proof is they have to pay. I mean, I don't see a bigger proof that a woman doesn't want to be with you. So I think, I find it a bit, it's too lax. I think that there are only 2 words that men really understand. It's repression and reputation. So the thing that really bothers them in those classes is that they are in the middle of other men, so those men recognize them, and also they are like facing a mirror. Essentially, they see who they are, and you know they want to be anonymous, and they themselves say it's not deterrent enough because it's not repressive enough. So I don't think it goes far.
There is one thing that really bugs Johns. It's that their wife learns about what they did. This is what really bothers them, really. And the rest, you know, when they say, oh, I didn't know, you know, they were really this terrible and I was not aware of it and so forth and so on. I mean, well, you know, Laurent said that, yes, I mean, there are some guys who said, I'm going to change, you know, I'm not going to go see a prostitute again. And I will be really convinced when they do studies about like, you know, during in the next years, like, you know, over like 5 years or even 2 or 3 years, how many men don't do that again, and how many again, you know, go to see prostitutes? And then, you know, when we have figures, we can decide. But when the word of men only, you know, I'm not going to do it again, I mean, I'm not convinced, you know.
Yes, I would also like to add a few. I mean, personally, I'm also not convinced, partly because of the outcome that they know when they talk to men who are abusive husbands. And some people who've been doing this work with these men for a long time said that in the end, it only trained men to be better and more clandestine perpetrators, to hide their tactics better, to become more suave, to be more manipulative even. And we know from Panthers Falls, which in Germany are also freely accessible and everywhere. Here again, you don't have to have any kind of computer skill. You just enter certain words and you can go into these forums where Johns discuss what they are doing. And from the discussion, you learn that they know exactly what they are doing. They know about it and they don't care. So it is not, they know the girls are trafficked. They know they are young. They know the girls don't want to do this or the women don't want to do it. And they do it anyway. And they even discuss their knowledge of trafficking and so on, because men always like to brag. So they top each other in these forums with their specialized knowledge about trafficking and stuff. And they absolutely know what they are doing. And I think when we understand the specific type of violence, enacting power over women is part of the kick. It is part of what they want to do. So how would they derive pleasure if they didn't know that this is what they are doing? They are not doing it because they want to have friendly, lovely, loving and equal sex. They are doing it because they want to exercise power. This is what they get up or off on in this system. And then to have a John school which explains that this is a power matter, I mean, so I don't know. I don't really think it works. I think this idea, like Sweden, that the wife gets a letter from the authorities, or not the wife gets the letter, but it's sent to the John's home. And it's a public letter, which you can see from the envelope. And so if you want to know what it is, and it is because he's been caught in prostitution, is very effective.
Yeah,
I'm not too convinced about these John schools or talk to these men. I believe being fined and being flat out stopped is going to work better.
Yeah,
you make such a good point about the just the intelligence that they put into it and their full awareness. Like we talk about abusive men, you know, we call them predators, and that's an appropriate term. But I think a lot of people think of that it means that they're like of subhuman intelligence and planning, that they're more animalistic, but they're fully human people who are bringing like all of themselves, all of their intelligence and their cunning and their knowledge of the law and customs, and they read the news like everybody else. They know these discussions are going on. They really do know what they're doing and what the implications are and how much harm they're causing. They talk about, and you can see it in porn, that the pain she's in, her distress, her discomfort is very often eroticized. It is the point. And then they go out and they want to practice that on a prostituted woman who is going to enjoy it no more than any other. And that's part of their entertainment.
Well, you could say pornography is a theory and prostitution is a practice, you know, that's how it works.
I also think that when I've studied not just Johns, but also the German research into Johns and the romanticization in that research, I found that there are a lot of parallels between myths regarding perpetrators of rape, rapists, and myths regarding Johns. And you have a certain set of myths which are about the perpetrator. In rape, the idea is it would be somebody of subhuman intelligence, a rough person. Often you have very racialized ideas, classist ideas, somebody who cannot control his drives, who is easily recognizable at first sight, and is operating outside of society. And then you see a real rapist in court, and he doesn't look like it at all. Or you see a real John who doesn't look like it at all, who's wearing a nice suit, who comes from any walk of life, any kind of background. So this myth clearly isn't true. And then you revert to myths which are directed around or centered around the victim. Since the perpetrator does not look like the myth prescribes, she must have done something wrong. So in rape, it was her behavior or her clothes, or she's lying, or all of the myths we have about victims. And in prostitution, you suddenly get either the woman who's too stupid or too lazy for anything else, or you get a positive kind of reinvention of a myth. She's the happy sex worker. But in any case, it is suddenly myths around the woman, the victim, that now are enacted. And all of these myths only serve to make sure society needn't think about her. Either she's not worth thinking about, or she's happy and she wanted it. It's a different kind of sauce, a different kind of dressing. But you have these parallels in how rape is regarded and what myths we have about victims and about perpetrators and about Johns and women in prostitution. And I don't understand how women who call themselves feminists and who can explain all of these rape myths seem suddenly incapable of transferring this to the field of prostitution. It's like being able to add 3 and 2. Sorry, Natasha.
Oh, it's just so easy to buy into those myths and accept them. And then again, when we're thinking of these men as being some kind of like animalistic subhuman, we don't recall, like, yes, they know these myths too. Maybe they picked these women because they fit into these myths. Maybe they pick their victims based on who we stigmatize as a society. And they say, oh, she's just like that. She's that kind of woman. She is that class of woman who it doesn't matter if she gets AIDS. It matters if his wife, who is the good type of woman. And like we all hear these stories so much that it really does. And sometimes it just takes a conversation to snap people out of it. But we really do have to have these foundational stories questioned so that these rapists can't hide behind them anymore.
I think
there is a basic fact. The average age of entering prostitution is 13 to 14. So, and I interviewed, in fact, 2 American girls who entered prostitution, one of them when she was 10 and the other one when she was 11. And the one, I don't remember if it was a 10 or 11 girl, but one of them told me that, of course, she was sold, the people that sold her insisted on the fact that she was very young. And one John even said when she met him that, oh, she's not that young. So, the problem of the prostitution of minors, she told me, in the US is huge. It's really, really underestimated.
And about the myths we were talking about, I think the way, so first of all, there's a distinction, Natasha talked about it too, the way that, what sounds like cognitive dissonance, you condemn the myths in one side and not the other. It's because we have completely assimilated the distinction made by male abusers of women in prostitution between the normal woman and the prostitutes. And that's what they always say. They say, I wouldn't do that with my wife, but I can do that with a prostitute. So we have distinguished ourselves. So this is even the term sex worker doesn't even have woman in it anymore. And Inge, it's what you were saying. Women in prostitution are not women. You become an object. And I think that whenever we talk about prostitution in the media, mainstream media, we never talk about men. You would think it's just women buying, women selling, and women being sold. It's like men don't exist. And it's just, you just see those happy women.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And at the end of such a conversation, suddenly the prostitution industry exists only to benefit women. it's a big service to us. That is how it turns out, what we get at the end. And it goes back to what Berlin published, and even some trade union, no, not some trade union, the German advocacy group for HIV positive persons and persons with AIDS, said re-allowing prostitution in Berlin. Berlin for about 5 minutes had the Nordic model. They instituted it for about 14 days, and then the Senate scrapped it. And the reasoning again was, oh, these poor women, they've got to make money. I mean, it's really, and that is advocacy centers saying it. So this is what you get in the end, by not talking about the men, and somehow it is for the benefit of women. Prostitution only exists because of some women who are like that. So this is what you need to turn around and talk about men to make people understand why you need the Nordic model, for example.
And that's the language we get here too. It's always about their agency, or, you know, you were saying that they have their marketing tools for like the LGBT lobby and everybody else, you know, everybody's got a set plan. Like here, they'll talk about how, well, LGBT teens get, you know, they're disproportionately homeless. They disproportionately end up doing survival sex work. And so, of course, you can't, you know, to outlaw it is to harm them, or to say that you can't do solicitation on a platform like Tumblr. Well, this, you know, this harms them. This, you know, keeps them from their livelihood. You're talked about like you're starving them to try to dismantle the trade. And you hear that no matter what, definitely, you know, people who will talk about, oh, well, we have to have a class analysis of race. We have to have a class analysis of, you know, for the working class and all this. But when we're talking about institutionalized rape, then all of a sudden it's all about the individual agency of this worker who has to do this or they will starve. And aren't you a meanie depriving them of their job?
Rachel Moran says something fantastic. The Irish survivor of prostitution. She says that when a woman is hungry, the human decent thing to do is to put bread in her mouth, not your penis. So essentially, you're abusing a poor person. You're not helping them out. And we've seen that with COVID. I mean, women were stranded out. If prostitution ever helped you lift out of poverty, you know, they would have been rich and would have set savings. But in prostitution, money is exchanged from men to men, you know, from the buyer to the pimp. And, you know, if prostitution is a job, how come nobody's ever laid out of it? Like, we're going to have so many unemployments. For some reason, there's never unemployment in prostitution. Why is that? You know, because it's not a job, because it's an exploitation. And the larger the pool of poor women, the more, you know, exploitation there is.
This is also important to understand, because we have a lot of people who are poor and nobody really cares. I mean, it is not the poverty is not the cause of prostitution, because just because a woman is poor, men don't give her money. But what poverty is a resource for prostitution. And that is also important when people talk about, oh, we need to dismantle and end poverty, and we need to address inequalities and so on and so on. And prostitution is just a kind of symptom. And if we manage to address poverty in our societies and inequalities, we could have the happy sex work part, but you can't, because inequality and disenfranchisement and all of the marginalization and the poverty are resources for this industry. It has a very great interest in keeping it up. And of course, women go back to poverty as soon as they are out, which is also another factor. I mean, they do not become not only rich, they go back. If they are German, they end up on welfare. And if they are not, they get sent back to their countries as soon as they are destitute, which is also a huge machinery. Germany sucks in young women from marginalized communities in Eastern Europe, uses them up, and as soon as they could become a problem because they are traumatized or have contracted STDs or would actually somehow have the right to access German social security, and then after 5 years at the latest they do, they are just sent back. So the problem is outsourced again. But poverty is simply a resource for prostitution. And so it is needed by it. And so prostitution as a global industry is going to do its best to keep it up, just as inequalities. And which means it is really at the root of problems. It's not just a minor symptom, but without dismantling prostitution, we cannot have equality or address women's poverty, because the industry wants that. But Natasha, what is it like in the United States now? I mean, in many countries, or many states, but I'd better say, you have a criminalization of everyone, don't you? Or how does it work?
Yeah, if you're a minor, we have in our federal law, because we have, you know, different layers of law where you might, you know, you've got one thing in federal law, but you might have a stricter or more lenient standard in state law, and it's complicated about which will apply. Our federal law has basically a Nordic model understanding for the trafficking of minors, where if you're a minor, you're automatically considered the victim of a crime, of extreme trafficking, basically. And, you know, it states very clearly that you should be held harmless from charges related to that, you know, so like you're trafficked and then your pimp forces you to commit other crimes and you're supposed to not be charged for those. You're supposed to be treated like a victim of a crime, which you are. It would be good if we could expand that to everyone, but the framework is there. The state laws, it's a patchwork. There's something like the Nordic model in Washington state, and they've been able to break up some trafficking rings, but it's complicated, and it's not something that people, it's not like a mainstream thing in discussion. It gets sort of relegated to conspiracy theory, and it doesn't help that there are conspiracy theories about sex trafficking that are really just kind of totally out there, but then it gives cover for people to dismiss and say, oh, well, this isn't really a problem, and only crazy conspiracy theorists talk about it, and only crazy conspiracy theorists even care about it. And all the real feminists are supporting the decriminalization of pimping and sex buying because they're trying to help the poor sex worker. And that's sort of where the state of discussion is now, where we had a ray of hope where we passed they're called the FOSTA/SESTA laws, which was an exception to the Communications Decency Act that gives like broad exemptions to internet service providers for content that's published there. And so it was a rollback of that exemption to where the state is, if they knowingly allow the sexual exploitation of minors on their platform, they can be prosecuted for that content and for basically that exchange. And so that allowed the federal government to go in and, you know, try to prosecute Backpage. You know, well, and then the pushback to that was that the founders of Backpage got this, you know, glossy cover feature article in Wired talking about this, you know, that the sort of feel of it was that, you know, they were being unreasonably persecuted by the government. This was a terrible threat to internet freedom. All of the internet freedom libertarians are horribly opposed to it. And you get no pushback from anyone who is like in liberal politics from it anymore. And then the LGBT lobby groups went after FOSTA-SESTA passed. And I'm told that they did this big training with the Democratic Congressional Caucus to convince them that they had just done some terrible thing and start pushing them towards thinking that this was a bad idea that was going to, you know, be harmful to LGBTQ youth. And no doubt they use the phrase, especially trans youth of color or something like that, because that's always the thing. It's like, you know, these are our civil rights favorites. And so to protect them, we have to allow people to buy them to rape them. And it's our discourse on it is a bunch of insane nonsense. I don't even know. There's not a good about it.
Talking about the links with funding, if you check on Craigslist page today, I don't know how long that's going to be up, but you'll see that among the causes they donate to, you will find St. James Infirmary, which is a notorious pro-pimp group from the US. So, you know, Craigslist also makes money from ads that are from prostitution, and it gives money to them. Pornhub also gives money to those pimp lobbies. There is self-sustaining systems. They're all the male buddies working together, really.
There's a whole ecosystem of, you know, that Craigslist and like the Ben & Jerry's Foundation that they donate to the US umbrella groups for the network of sex work projects and sort of their apologists in media. And, you know, just sort of the atmosphere of the culture wars here, where even conservatives have kind of pulled back from saying anything about any of this because, you know, I think the feeling was, well, we don't want to get painted as squares. But there wasn't an alternative discourse publicly because that had been silenced years ago about the harms to women. You know, like those women had been shuffled off, you know, into the closet of like mainstream feminist activism. And so just recently, we've had a resurgence with, you know, Layla Micklewade at Exodus Cry is leading the charge against Pornhub. And that's taken off and it's been hugely popular. And it was clearly like an unmet need. So we've had kind of that thing like you were talking about, Inga, where, you know, it used to be that if somebody was talking about this, we probably knew who they were or we'd heard of them or something. And now it just seems like people are talking about it all over social media because once somebody finally does start talking about, hey, these videos are like clear-cut exploitation of children and people's rapes that have been filmed and monetized and like even rape in the sense of like he didn't pay her. It's really woken people up, and so that is a bright spot. People are talking about it now in a way that they weren't.
Yes, I mean, what I found is when, for example, in Frankfurt in our action, when we had our talks, we always came prepared as if we had to do a state exam. You know, when you memorize footnotes and numbers and figures and footnotes so you can answer every question. And we found most of our listeners didn't know much about it. And often people came who were on our side, but they really wanted support in arguing it through, because at first these marketing strategies of the pro-sex industry sound so convincing that they felt it was wrong but didn't know what to say. And what we found now is also, for example, in our Frankfurt action, of course, those who disagree with us wouldn't come and talk to us, but many people who talk to us believe that prostitution is violence against women and that it is a bad thing. But the two myths which are still very powerful, even among decent people, I mean, nice people, good people, and decent people, is this myth that legal makes it safe and illegal would make it go underground. It's a very, very powerful myth. And we really need to keep working at exploding it. And then you have these tactics of confusing people by talking about differences between legalization and decriminalization, which in practice do not exist. I mean, you can have a decriminalized regime like New Zealand, which at first had more regulations about brothels than the legalized system in Germany had. It's a kind of merchant of doubt tactics. It always reminds me of an internet meme about a simplification of 1 plus 2 makes 3. And suddenly you get 5 lines of square roots and brackets and whatever as a simplification, trying to turn something straightforward into a complicated issue. And the same about ideas that somehow this underground would make it so much worse. But the answer is the exploded market. But even people who are kind believe this. I mean, they are scared about stories about it going underground. And some people always will come up with, but what about the woman who really wants to do it? And then you've got to say, yes, well, but if she really wants to do it, she can do it. She just won't have this state-guaranteed infrastructure for the benefit of men. I mean, that's what prostitution is, a state-guaranteed infrastructure for the sexual use of women by men for a fee. And she will have to organize her own buyers. Sometimes a buyer might be arrested. If a buyer is abusive, she has a marginally better chance of going to the police because she's going to be recognized as a victim, and he is already, as buyer, recognized as a criminal. In practice, a woman who takes a buyer to court is not going to have any buyers anymore. So prostitution is abusive and her chances of doing so are slim. But right now, it's like Yagmur said, he isn't raping her if he paid. and she's just a prostitute and he's a buyer. And under a legal system which criminalizes buyers, she's taking somebody to court who is at least recognized already as somebody in the wrong, as somebody who has been enacting violence. So even the one who wants to do it, well, if she really wants to do it, or if she wants to have her one-night stands monitorized and so on, she can organize it. We're not going after her. The worst thing that's going to happen to her is somebody asks her if she wants help. And if she says no, that's it. But it's these two bits which are still quite powerful and which we need to work at. And it always shows that legal does not make it safe. But the happy sex work discourse is mostly dead in Germany. I mean, that's a huge advantage. It still exists.
That's good.
I would like to ask a last question to Inge. Is the abolitionist movement progressing in Germany?
Yes. Right now, I mean, I'm here because of COVID, because I just couldn't face being on a train. But right now, there was a bigger congress again in Bonn, again for abolitionist groups to meet, to restate different aims. And they had working groups now, for example, on social work and on the kind of training session and education and training you need for social workers, and on the kind of material social workers need in their training course. And you had one for politicians. We have this movement, this group, Netzwerk Eller by Huschke Mau, which is like the PRIS in Norway. It's made up of survivors and women still in prostitution who want to get out, who speak up as survivors. We have municipalities looking at how to implement the Nordic model municipally. So it is progressing. It's not progressing as much on the visible stage now, because it now has really gone into the municipalities where people organize round tables, and now suddenly it is no longer a pro-prostitution one, or where the pro-prostitution activists still talk a lot, but aren't heard. The Green Party, I mean, they were the most pro-prostitution group in Germany among politicians. The Munich feminist Green Party group invited us to talk about prostitution. And there was a young woman who had a great presentation, a doctor who spoke about the physical harms. And again, we went in prepared like anything. And out of the 30 people in the room, there was only one person who was advocating in favor of the sex industry. Everybody else was on our side. They'd only invited us to get the sources, to get the lines of arguments, to get the information. So we are progressing now on a ground level. There still is a lot of pushback, and I don't know what will happen, but a few years ago, I felt as if we'd pulled the car out of the ditch and out of the mud, and we've gotten it on the road and it's facing the right direction. So you still got to push it home, we still got to push it uphill, it could still go back into the ditch and all of it. But as a cart, it's back on the road. We can now push it towards something. So there are quarrels and fragmentations and whatever as happens in political movements. I think we are progressing because we're now really on the ground in the municipalities. So there is hope.
To add up just on your example about choice, Inge, because this woman's choice, you can see that in prostitution, it's always ultimately a man's choice, because even in the example you gave,
of course,
there are phenomena that only appear when there are two. You know, you can't have the act of teaching without a teacher and a student. Otherwise, you're just learning, right? So with prostitution as well, we have the same thing. It always takes two. So even in the example you gave, the woman just stands right by the corner the whole night. If the man doesn't make the choice to abuse her, prostitution will not take place.
That is a very important point indeed. Absolutely. And all of the question of what kind of choice it is. But it's just when, yeah. And you're right. I mean, it's like poverty is not the reason, because if nobody bought her, nobody would care how poor she is. I hope you will get it in France. It's a great example for us.
Tremendous. Well, does anyone have anything that they would like to say to wrap up?
Thank you for organizing this, Natasha.
Oh, sure. Thank you all, and for providing such clear language, everyone. You know, it's so easy for people to fall prey to that sort of like, well, actually, did you know, and you think that you're going to be introduced to some kind of special knowledge and you're going to be able to, have some gotcha to share with your peers, which I think liberals in America, I don't know about, everywhere else, but, are definitely prey to, like, we want to have the inside scoop on what's, this is the latest thing. And, so people can be convinced to think that, you could legalize it so that commercialized rape was safe, but you just can't make rape safe. And so I think Yagmur, like, thank you for your brilliant, clear language, and thank you, Francine and
Well,
Inga.
I apologize for not being in the best of shape, but I'm having surgery in 2 days, and I'm very, very tense. And like everybody else, during the COVID, we don't sleep good. I mean, it's just, we have a very sort of we have nightmare and stuff like that. I'm just not in my best shape, really. I apologize for that, but I was tempted not to accept, but I said, okay, it's just I did my best, really.
You brought a lot of information and a lot of details. I mean, that was really, really important. And I think it gave people the overview people need to understand what is happening. And also, all the best for your surgery.
Thanks.
Bless you, Francine. And thank you both. Thank you all for the overviews. I think it would be very hard to look at everything you'd said and conclude that this could ever be made decent or safe or anything of the kind. So that was just a wealth of information. Thank you, Francine, Inga, Yagmur.
Thank
Take
you.
care.